happy to be here. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm coming from the Medical University of South Carolina. I'm part of the youth collaborative there. Our focus is on adolescence and substance use and developing more efficient and effective treatments for adolescents who use substances. So this is the fantastic team at MUSC that I get to work with. So it may not be surprising to folks in this room that substance use is typically initiated during adolescence. And we see rates of use increase from middle school into college years, so kind of peaking during college years, with alcohol and cannabis being the two most commonly used substances during adolescence and young adulthood. And so that's what a lot of my talk is going to be focused on today, are alcohol and cannabis use. And something to point out is that vaping is very common and popular. It's the third most popular substance used by adolescents and young adults. But my talk today is focused on how the brain develops and how substances affect brain development. And vaping is relatively new to the scene. So we don't have a lot of good data on how vaping in particular affects brain development. And one more thing I want to point out is that opioid use is still fairly irregular among adolescents and young adults. Thankfully, the opioid epidemic has not impacted adolescents. There has been an increase, as you've probably seen in the news recently, of overdoses among adolescents and young adults. And this is due to fentanyl being in a lot of the drugs that are being used. So one of the things that I want to get across in my talk today is that substance use disorders are developmental disorders. So a lot of the very early research done, particularly in alcohol use disorder, was done in veterans, so mostly male populations, middle-aged populations in the VA. And what we know is that substance use starts really early, and it affects people across genders, races, ethnicities, and it impacts many of us. So since I'm coming to Virginia, I wanted to see what are the rates of alcohol and cannabis use in Virginia. So in yellow are rates of alcohol in the past month by adolescents aged 12 to 17 in Virginia. They are slightly higher than average across the US. And then for cannabis, about 5% of 12 to 17-year-olds report using in the past month, slightly lower. So a little bit higher rates of alcohol, a little bit lower rates of cannabis use here in Virginia. One other thing that is really important to mention is that the earlier someone uses alcohol, cannabis, and other drugs, the more problems they tend to have later on. So I love this slide here. So on the x-axis, you see age from 13 to 21, and the kids who start using alcohol at age 13 are so much more likely, 4 times more likely, to have an alcohol use problem during their lifetime than kids who start using at age 18 or 21. And this is really important. We talk a lot in schools in Charleston. We go out and do outreach activities where we communicate with kids, delay, delay, delay. The longer you delay using substances, the less likely it is that you'll have problems later on. And for every year that a youth delays using alcohol, there's a 14% reduction in them having problems later on in life. So again, really important message with delaying. So another interesting thing about youth drinking is the way that kids drink. So they don't tend to drink as much as adults do, but when they drink, they tend to drink in what we call binge drinking quantities, which is defined in research as 4 more drinks on an occasion for girls and 5 or more drinks for boys. And we know that in the past month, about 14% of high school seniors and a quarter of college students report binge drinking in the last 2 weeks. And a really cool thing about this statistic is that every year I update my slides, and every year this number reduces. So it's been wonderful to see that the public health message of delaying or reducing use when kids do use has been received by a lot of kids. So like I was saying before, youth drink half as often but a third more. So in this slide here, we can see youth in blue, and they're drinking about 4 days on average a month, so about once a week, whereas adults in red are drinking about twice per week. But when they're drinking, kids tend to drink more. So they're drinking closer to binge drinking levels than adults do. And we know that binge drinking peaks in young adulthood. And so the rates of use peak right around the age, of course, in the US, that alcohol becomes legal, right? So around age 21, we see this pretty big increase due to increased access of alcohol. And the other interesting thing about alcohol use is that it affects adolescents differently. So teens tend to have less negative effects from drinking and more positive effects from drinking when compared to adults. So teens report less hangovers than adults do and less motor impairment. So that's the kind of slurring or stumbling when someone is drunk. Teens tend to not experience those motor impairments as much as adults do. So not only are they having less negative effects, but they're having more positive effects. So teens report more rewarding experiences when they're drinking, and also more social facilitation. So they feel cooler when they're drinking, more social when they're drinking. So the other interesting thing is that cannabis is also increasing during adolescence into young adulthood. And we see these rates of alcohol and cannabis use increasing throughout the teen years. And one reason for some of the increases, at least in daily use of cannabis, is the reduction in the perception of harm. So I think this slide is really interesting because if you look in the early 90s, almost 80% of youth reported that regular cannabis use would be harmful to your health. That has plummeted to only about 1 in 5 teens reporting that they think regularly using cannabis would be harmful for your health. And I think a lot of this is coming from the changing legal landscape around cannabis that we've been seeing over the past several decades. And another important thing to point out is the ratio of THC to CBD in cannabis products has been increasing substantially over the last several decades. So THC is the part of cannabis that gets you high. It's the psychoactive piece. CBD is the part you've probably heard a lot about. It's most famously known for treating pediatric seizures, and there's a potential therapeutic effect of CBD. But the ratio of the psychoactive THC and CBD has increased significantly over the years. So there are products out there that now have 80-90% THC levels that can get someone very, very high. So that's why we've seen this increase in ER admissions related to cannabis use. When I'm talking to parents and kids, I talk about it like if you had 5 shots of Miller Lite over an hour, that'd be about 1 drink. So you might be a little drunk, but not very drunk with 1 drink over the course of 1 hour. But if a kid was to use take 5 shots of Everclear over an hour, that would be a very different effect. So this is something that we try to talk to kids about if you don't know the THC level of the product that you're using, there could be adverse consequences. And again, that's why we've seen some increase in cannabis-related ER visits. So why do we care about substance use during adolescence? Adolescence is a period of time when the brain is undergoing a substantial amount of neurodevelopment. And so your brain is actually developing until about age 25. So if there's any college students in the room, your brain's probably still developing. And the video showing the areas in blue where the brain is developing. So the brain regions are developing at different times. And the overall size of the brain does not change. So it's not that your brain's getting bigger during adolescence, but there is a reduction in what we call gray matter and an increase in white matter, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But again, this brain development is going on until about age 25. Very interesting, right? Because car insurance companies figured this out way before neuroscientists did. Because when can you rent a car? Age 25. They had lots of data showing more risky behaviors in those under age 25 and wouldn't let you rent a car because of it. So what is gray matter? Gray matter are the neurons in the brain. So this is where your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions happen in gray matter. And during adolescence, young adulthood, adolescence and young adulthood, we see a reduction in gray matter. And this is a good thing. So there's this, you're born with an overabundance of gray matter, and over time, gray matter reduces because it's kind of like the quote, use it or lose it. So it's amplifying connections that are used often and getting rid of connections that you don't need in the brain. So by age 17 to 15, you lose about 50% of your neurons, which is good. It's healthy. Your brain's becoming more efficient. And white matter is the part of the brain that's connecting all of these gray matter regions. So I talk about it as like the superhighways in the brain. And during adolescence, we see this significant increase in white matter. So it's like the paving of these roads in the brain, making them more efficient to get to point A, from point A to point B. And like I talked about before, your brain doesn't develop all at the same time. So there are these, the reward systems in the brain develop before the cognitive control systems. So adolescents have fully developed reward systems where they find things very pleasurable, but not fully developed frontal lobes, where there's cognitive control, inhibition, centers of the brain. So a lot of people use the analogy of adolescents having fully developed gas pedals and not fully developed brakes quite yet. And we also know that there are differences in the way that boys' and girls' brains develop. So boys' brains develop about 1 to 2 years behind boys' brains. They catch up. But there is this difference in how boys' and girls' brains develop. And so that's something that we look for in our research is, does alcohol affect boys and girls differently because of this difference in brain development? And another important point is that during young adulthood, adolescence, and childhood, this is when a lot of psychiatric disorders emerge. So I'm talking a lot today about alcohol and cannabis use, but we know that they co-occur, alcohol and cannabis use co-occur with other psychiatric disorders, including ADHD, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia. In later adolescence and young adulthood is when we see substance use disorders tend to emerge, as well as mood disorders. So we can't really talk about alcohol and cannabis use in a bubble because we know that there's high co-occurrence of substance use with these other psychiatric disorders. Okay, so to sum up that first part, the brain is undergoing a significant amount of neural development during adolescence and young adulthood up until age 25. This is also a time when kids tend to start using alcohol and cannabis, and boys' brains develop about 1 to 2 years before girls' brains. So today I'm going to be talking about 3 different things. How does substance use affect the developing brain? And when I started doing this research about 15 plus years ago, there was a lot of cross-sectional studies, which means just one snapshot in time. Where they looked at brains of kids who used alcohol and cannabis and brains of kids who did not use alcohol or cannabis. And they found that there were differences. But when you're only looking at one point in time, it's unclear if those differences pre-existed. So that kid was born that way, they had differences in their brain that made them more vulnerable to use, or if the differences were related to substance use itself. So today I'll be answering that chicken or egg question from some longitudinal studies that we've been doing over the past several years. I'll also talk about, can some of these cognitive functions recover with abstinence? And then I'll do a brief part about treatment, and I know y'all will get a lot more information on treatment later in the conference as well. So the studies I'll be talking about are longitudinal studies. So we take kids at baseline when they're preteens, like around some of the studies 9 to 14. And at baseline, we recruit kids who have never used alcohol and cannabis. And we do a bunch of things. We do cognitive testing, we get magnetic resonance imaging or MRI images of their brain, and we ask a lot of clinical questions and interviews. And then we follow them up through the years and into young adulthood. And of course, over that period of time, some kids will transition into substance use and others will remain non-users. And so, of course, in clinical human studies, you can't assign, it would be very unethical to assign kids to a drinking or non-drinking group. So that's why we have these longitudinal, naturalistic, observational studies where we can then see, we know what their brains looked like at baseline, we know the trajectory of brain development for kids who don't use, and how do we compare that to kids who do start using over that period of time. So like I said, we use MRI. It's non-invasive, it's just a big old magnet, and no dyes, injections. The only unsafe part with working with teens is that teens have braces, so we can't put a kid with a mouthful of metal in a big old scanner, although there are some techniques that we can use now, and some of the metals aren't as dangerous that we use now. But when they're in the scanner, we get two kinds of images. So structural images, so that's just looking a picture of the brain. What does the neuroanatomy look like? And functional images. So they actually do tasks while they're in the scanner, and we measure which parts of their brain are being utilized when they're doing these cognitive tasks. We also do cognitive testing with them. We call it games and puzzles. That sounds way more fun than cognitive testing. And some of you may recognize some of these if you've ever been IQ tested or had to be cognitive tested yourself. Previously we do pen and pencil, but now everything is on computers, and we measure things like attention and learning and inhibition through these tasks. So how does substance use affect the developing brain? This study was done a few years ago with a group from San Diego this is where I did my graduate training, and we looked at how alcohol affected cognitive development from ages 12 to 18. And we found that kids who started drinking alcohol regularly showed declines in their verbal memory, visuospatial ability, and their psychomotor and processing speed. So there were differences behaviorally in kids who started drinking during adolescence when we compared them to kids who did not. And so, adolescence is a time when kids start learning how to drive, so things like spatial ability and processing speed are really important, so we talk to kids about that when we do some of our outreach programs. There was a great meta-analysis done by Brianna Lees several years ago now, looking at binge drinking and the developing brain. So meta-analysis is when you take just a bunch of data from a bunch of studies and combine them together, so you have a much larger sample size. And overall, adolescent binge drinking was related to small cognitive deficits. The more pronounced deficits were in inhibitory control and then decision-making. So poor inhibitory control and decision-making in kids who started binge drinking during adolescence. So this was a really famous study done in New Zealand where they followed kids up from adolescence until about age 40. And they looked at IQ over that period of time. And they compared non-users to people who had used cannabis very heavily during their teenage years. And IQ is a very stable indicator. You don't really expect much change over the lifetime of someone's IQ. And in those who did not use, they saw 1 point, on average, 1 point increase in IQ, so about the same. And in those who used cannabis during adolescence, they saw an 8-point decline in IQ. This was only for kids who started using cannabis heavily during adolescence. For adults who started using cannabis, they didn't see the same declines. So again, heavy cannabis use associated with declines in IQ during adolescence. And this was another meta-analysis, again, pooling a bunch of data from a bunch of studies. So the red arrow there shows where there'd be like no difference between those who used cannabis during adolescence and young adulthood and those who did. And as you can see, the most pronounced effects were poor learning, processing speed, memory, inhibition. So a number of measures where they saw poor cognitive functioning in kids using cannabis versus those who did not. And interestingly, the longer someone abstained, the smaller the effect size is. So it looks like with time, those cognitive functions would come back online and they would perform more similarly to those who did not use cannabis. In this study, we looked at brain structure. Again, that's the structural MRI, so just taking pictures of the brain and looking at volume of the brain. And remember, normal development, reduction in gray matter, increase in white matter. So the box on the left are the gray matter regions of the brain, box on the right, white matter regions of the brain. And what we see in our controls is basically what we would expect. So a reduced gray matter, increased white matter during adolescence. So synaptic pruning's happening, but also the highways are getting paved in the brain. For our drinkers, we saw accelerated declines in gray matter and less increases in white matter volume. So again, this is longitudinal data showing that kids who were using alcohol during adolescence had differences in how their brain developed compared to kids who were not. We saw minimal sex differences. The only area of the brain that we saw a difference between boys and girls was in the temporal lobe, so that's where your memory is. And so we saw boys had greater reductions in gray matter in that region. But overall, very minimal sex differences. We also looked at white matter in adolescent alcohol and cannabis co-users. And what we found is that the co-users, the white matter tracts in their brains were not paving as efficiently as those who were not using. And then a lot of the fMRI studies can be really confusing, and if you read about them in popular press, it's like more activation, less activation. It can be really complicated to interpret the findings. So this is interpreting a bunch of different findings all together. But basically what we see is that early on in substance use, if someone is using, we see greater activation in the brain. But their performance is the same as non-users. So how we interpret that is that their brains are working a little harder, but they can keep up. But over time, with continued use, we see less activation and then poorer performance. So early on compensation, but with continued use, we see poorer performance and differences in reductions in brain activation. So a few things to consider from these studies that's really important is that a lot of these studies were done in places where it was pretty high socioeconomic status. The kids who were recruited were really healthy and had no co-occurring psychopathology, so no ADHD, anxiety disorders, depression. They were recruited specifically that way because the studies were interested in how does alcohol or cannabis affect the developing brain. And a lot of the data that I just presented were subclinical levels of use. So these were not kids who were meeting criteria for alcohol or cannabis use disorder. They were kids who were using and using heavily when they used, but not using very frequently. So something to think about contextualizing these findings is that if there are other factors on board, like co-occurring psychopathology or other environmental factors, we might see even more pronounced effects. And we have several studies on the books that are providing data to give us a better understanding of how alcohol interacts with a multitude of factors. So there's the NCANDA study where they're recruiting 800 youth across 5 sites from ages 12 to 30. The sample is up to age 30, so we'll be able to look into adulthood. And then this is our MUSC site, where one of the sites, VCU is the site for this study, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, or ABCD study, where we are collecting data on 12,000 youth at 21 different sites. All kids were 9 to 10 at baseline, and we've been following them up for several years now, so they're up to age 15. It's been really fun watching them develop. And all of this data is publicly available, by the way. So if anyone wants to do analyses using this data to answer some of these important questions about substance use and brain development, that data is available. Okay, so to sum up that first part, after alcohol and cannabis use, we see a reduction in neuropsychological functioning, including reduced IQ, visuospatial functioning, attention, memory, processing speed, decision-making, and impulse control. We see differences in the structure of the brain and how the structure of the brain develops into young adulthood. And we see functional differences. So there's this early compensation, but then we don't see that compensatory effect with continued use. And we did a review last year where we found that co-use showed the most pronounced effects, so alcohol and cannabis together. So are the effects permanent? there was a study done in San Diego. I really love this study. It's really interesting. So at baseline, there were controls and heavy drinkers, and they had the heavy drinkers remain abstinent for 5 weeks. They paid the kids a lot of money to remain abstinent. It's called contingency management. It's used in treatment settings. And they had kids do a task called block design. And so if you see up there, the kids are supposed to match the blocks to these complex patterns, and it gets progressively harder as time goes on. And what they found was that at baseline, the heavy drinkers in red performed worse on the task than the controls. But by 5 weeks of abstinence, they were actually performing at statistically non-significant differences. I just said that in the weirdest way I possibly could have said it. So controls and heavy drinkers were performing about at the same level after the heavy drinkers remained abstinent. As you can see, everyone improved performance because practice effects. If you're doing the same task over and over, you expect people to do better at it. But the heavy drinkers had greater increases in their performance than the controls. We also give the kids a task called the PASAT, and this task sounds mean because it kind of is. It's a distress tolerance task. So they have numbers coming at them on the computer screen. They have to add them very, very quickly. It's impossible to do, and it makes this horrible bonk noise when you don't do it correctly, and it's a very distressing task. So we measure frustration, irritability, and happiness. And our heavy drinkers at baseline were more frustrated, more irritable, and less happy after performing the task than our controls. But after 5 weeks of abstinence, they had similar levels of frustration, irritability, and happiness. And so this kind of matches up with what we see clinically, where people who are abstinent for a longer period of time, they say that they have better control over their emotions. So this data kind of paralleled what we see clinically. We also texted them daily, and what we found was that there was less negative mood, less depression, and less anxiety, again, matching what we see clinically when kids remain abstinent over a period of time. And I love this animal study. So animal studies can do things and learn about things in a way that we cannot. And so there was a study done by Linda Spear and her group where they had rats who during adolescence drank water and rats who drank alcohol heavily. And they measured things called play behaviors in rats. And if there's any like basic scientist in the room, I'm like oversimplifying this way too much. But they measure like how often the rat plays with a cotton ball and how often the rats play fight each other. And usually adolescent rats mature out of that behavior. And what they found, the adolescent rats who had water, they grew up to be like mature adult rats who didn't play with cotton balls and didn't play fight each other anymore. But those who had used alcohol during adolescence continued to have these behaviors that were considered immature for adult rats. And so again, this matches up to what we sometimes see clinically, where I'll have people come to me and say, my loved one has been sober for many, many years, but they continue to be kind of stuck back in when they were using and haven't matured out of certain behaviors from when they had started using heavily during adolescence. So while some of the effects do seem to dissipate with abstinence, some effects seem to be more longer term. So some information for talking to parents and youth, some do's for parents, talk to youth. I love this statistics. Adolescent whose parents talk to them about alcohol use are 42% less likely to drink than teens of parents who do not. So I think that there's this misconception that if you talk to kids about use, that they will then use because you're putting ideas in their head that they didn't already have in their head. We know that that's not true. The more that you talk to youth about use, the less likely it is that they will use problematically. And I would start the conversations really young. So you can start the healthy brain conversations when kids are super young. So you can talk to them about, you have one brain, it controls your whole body, and you want it to be as healthy as possible. And so it's really important to sleep because sleep is really good and it makes your brain healthy. It's good to eat vegetables, makes your brain healthy, makes it work efficiently. It's good to do homework because it helps your brain learn and grow. And then as kids start getting older, starting to add on alcohol, drug use, vaping into those conversations because they already know about their brain and how important it is to keep it healthy. Another thing when thinking about these healthy brain discussions, sometimes parents wonder, like, when is too early? And there's literature called alcohol expectancy literature, where they ask kids, how do you think alcohol will make you feel? And there's positive expectancies and negative expectancies. So a positive expectancy would be, alcohol would make me cool, alcohol would make me funny. A negative expectancy would be, alcohol would make me sick or make me look silly in front of my friends. And kids already start having expectancies about alcohol around age 5. So even if you're not using it at home, it's in popular media, it's in neighbors' homes, and so they have this idea that alcohol changes adults' behaviors, and they're usually aware of it quite at a young age. A few do nots for parents. There's been a lot of controversy in the literature about this, where there's this myth that if you teach kids how to drink, they'll learn how to drink and then they'll drink really responsibly. And so a lot of people call it like the European approach. And what has bared out in the literature is that this permissive approach actually leads to more problematic use and higher likelihoods of kids using heavily and developing problems into adulthood. And actually rates of binge drinking and substance use problems are higher in a lot of European countries. So that's like a common myth that French people know how to drink better, or Dutch people know how to drink better than US teens, and that's actually not true when you look at the epidemiological data. The other thing is that that effects are not only temporary. So sometimes kids will say, like, once my hangover's done, like, I'm back to normal. But from the research, we have shown that there is some cognitive improvement with abstinence, but some of these effects are longer term because your brain is, again, going through that significant amount of neural development. And then you guys have seen all the articles where it's like, drinking a glass of wine with dinner is good for your health. There's been really good, big studies that have come out recently showing that there really aren't health benefits from moderate drinking, and that it's okay for adults who do not have problematic substance use, but there aren't really health benefits. So that's another myth that I like to talk about in these talks. And so I know that I showed this slide before, but I love this slide so much. So this is, remember, when the longer you delay, the less likely it is that you will have a substance use disorder in your lifetime. And sometimes with kids, they say, my parents had substance use problems, my grandparents had substance use problems, and they feel like it's their destiny almost to have a substance use problem. And so when you look at those who are called family history positive, so that means that they have parents, grandparents who have a history of alcohol use disorder, they are more likely to develop problematic substance use. But, and then the family history negative in blue are less likely earlier on in adolescence. So if you get to age 18, the difference is not statistically significant. So that's another thing that we try to communicate to kids, is that you actually have a lot of say in this. The longer you delay drinking, no matter what your family history is, no matter what your genetics are, the better off that you will be. Okay, so this last part is super quick. What's normal? A really important point is that most youth who use substances do not develop a substance use disorder. I like to tell parents that because I think that relieves a lot of pressure. However, the prevalence is still quite high, where 16% of 18 to 25-year-olds have an alcohol use disorder and 15% have some other type of substance use disorder, whether it's cannabis, nicotine, et cetera. And I know one of the talks will get at this later more, but treatment utilization in the US is really, really poor. So on the slide here in blue are those who need treatment. So these are people who meet criteria for a substance use disorder. And as you can see, it peaks really high by ages 18 to 25. So that's the highest rates where almost a quarter of all 18 to 25-year-olds meet criteria for some substance use disorder. The percent who actually get treatment is abysmally low. So only 6.5% of the population who needs treatment actually gets treatment, and the rates are the worst for the 18 to 25-year-old age range. And for those few who do get treatment, a lot of kids are not getting evidence-based treatment and evidence-based care. There aren't a lot of medication options. I want to be really clear, there's never going to be a pill that fixes substance use disorders, but medication can be helpful in reducing craving or in making therapy more salient for kids and adults. And there are FDA-approved medications for adult alcohol use disorder, but no FDA-approved medications for adolescents except for buprenorphine, which is approved down to age 16 for opioid use disorder only. So remember in that first slide where I showed you the most commonly used drugs are alcohol, cannabis, nicotine? We have no FDA-approved medications for any of those for adolescents. The effect sizes for existing treatments are small to modest, and most youth end up using after treatment. So again, very few kids are getting treatment. Kids that are getting treatment are not getting oftentimes the most effective treatment, and there is use post-treatment for most kids. But there are some interventions that have been shown to be really effective. So there are things like group or individual cognitive behavioral therapy. There's also been third wave cognitive behavioral therapies that have been shown to be effective, like acceptance and commitment therapy, which is really values-based, which can be really helpful in adolescent groups. I work with a clinician who works with adolescents who loves ACT because it's all about values. So you know, if a kid is saying, it's really important for me to grow up and have this career, to do this in my life, then it provides that platform for, well, how are your behaviors inconsistent with the values that you have and where you want to go in life? So that's another option. Motivational enhancement therapy, contingency management, which I talked about before, which is having rewards, paying people or in rewards to remain abstinent, which has been really effective, especially in short term. And then, of course, family-based treatment. So we know that involving families is really important, because what you don't want is to have a kid who learns all these great skills and is able to implement them, and then family members accidentally reinforce the wrong behaviors. So making sure everyone's on the same page with family-based treatment. All right, so in summary, substance use disorders are developmental disorders. The earlier you start, the more likely you are to have problems later on in life. Substance use disorders can emerge during adolescence and young adulthood, and actually peak during young adulthood. Teen substance use affects the way that the brain develops. So we showed lots of data showing how the brains of kids who use look different than the brains of kids who don't. There is some recovery with abstinence, but some of the effects are longer term. We want to talk to youth and try to delay drinking age and any substance use age as much as possible. And if treatment is warranted, we want to make sure that it is evidence-based treatment. So one more thank you to all of my collaborators at the Youth Collaborative at MUSC, and thank you all so much for listening.